The idea of this session is really to talk about a bit more about the detail. So it's certainly not going to go into really the nth degree in here, but there are a lot of guidelines out there that you can follow. There's things like the NIST, the IEC 62443. There's lots of them out there, and we've looked at a lot of those to design this content for you. We understand that not every facility is the same, so it is a bit of a high-level blanket sort of statement. So you'll see a lot of high-level architectures and things like that. There is a lot of notes in the background that we've hidden, so we've purposely not put up all these guidelines on the screen for you in loads of lists, because, well, that'd be a hell of a boring presentation for the next hour. But what we have done is we've hidden them, so when we send the slides to you, you can look back through it and you can see all that detail if you do so want to go into that. So we start with an arc-defined maturity model for cybersecurity. And the idea with this is that, very much to what Jay was referring to earlier, you start small and you start at the bottom, and you'll be on this journey at some point along the way. You may be further up this tree, and we'll come back to it at the end once we've gone through a lot of the detail of this. But your first step, and one of the things that you mentioned earlier, was about those zones and conduits. So it's about securing that perimeter, securing that local area. And then at the other end, you've got things like IDS systems. So it's these intrusion detection systems, things with clever anomalies in the background that will detect these threats, threat detection. And really, as we go through this journey, we're going to be talking very much to the defense in-depth strategy that Jay showed a bit later on. And we've done it in a few different ways. So if we look at a high-level overview of some architectures, and certainly we try to structure this part of it, and you'll see a few of these slides coming up in terms of the past, the present, and the future. So we try to define what we're seeing as an organization, with certainly how we've done it previously, how some of us still do it today, where we're going to, and then what the future might hold, and the way you can get more out of these systems. So in terms of the past, we certainly presume that by isolating our environments, we're inherently secure. By removing that connection between that enterprise layer, we have a secure SCADA environment at that bottom end. As we've started to progress, we know that we still need some data transfer between the two. We have to understand what our work orders are to be able to produce that product at the bottom end. So there has to be some way to get that data across. Yes, some of it might be manually written, but the chances are we're using things like USB sticks and the like to be able to get things between those two areas. And we all know what USB sticks can do to our environment. When we look at the present and a more structured approach, and this is things that we're starting to see much more regularly now, and this is that demilitarized zone that Jay alluded to earlier, and we'll go into more depth around this, but it's around inserting that layer that we have that secure area in between. So that is that IT to OT convergence, if you like, that collaboration between the two. And then for the future, what we're really looking at now is an everything connected world. That's becoming easier when we look at the advent of things like Industry 4 and IIoT. We can get data from more places. But when we start to do this, we can have a fully digitally connected supply chain. So we can get much more out of our systems. We can provide much better service to our customers. But we have to ensure that we do that in a secure manner. We've mentioned an awful lot about people already, and the three of these things aligned, and they have to be aligned for us to be able to succeed. Certainly the process and technology follow, but really this kind of thing has to be a culture that you believe in, or your organization believes in, to make these solutions that we introduce to our system fly. What we're not looking at doing is replacing or removing people from the equation. We're looking about empowering, training, educating those people so that we can do a better job. We can be more secure with our processes to make sure that we're following the right stringent security processes when people enter the building, things like this. We've put physical security at the beginning of the presentation. It was tough to find where it sit in terms of a different level as we go through this Purdue model, or the IEC 62443. And the reason being is that you can do as small amounts. You can have your cannons at the entrance. Very unlikely in our scenarios, I know. But with this kind of thing, we see a real demarcation between our IT and OT worlds. This is a really clear way that we're seeing huge differences. security and physical security will always come up in an audit. Jay mentioned that earlier. That demarcation between the two, if you go to a server room that is in your enterprise layer, the chances are you've got to enter some sort of code to get into the server room. They tend to be locked down. There's lots of customer sites that I've been to where those server rooms exist as part of your control room. They're not in a locked cabinet. There's lots of different things you can do. It's a very important part of it. It should never be overlooked. We've left it here. We're not going to go into detail on it. If you want to find out more, then by all means give us a heads up, have a chat with us. In terms of the presentation itself, these are the layers that we've separated it out to. So shortly, Tim's going to start talking about network security for you. We'll then move into that demilitarized zone, then go into the manufacturing zone and the SCADA zone that you should all be very familiar with. And we'll keep coming back to this slide so we can show you at what part of that journey we're up to. Tim?
Thanks, Andy. So let me start off by putting up some of the findings that one of our network engineers, like a solutions PT, found when performing one of the audits. And the ones that I want to point out to you is really that he found that there was no segregation between these different networks. So it was extremely flat, a single flat network. Obviously had a few switches, but that every device had a direct internet access out. And as we keep alluding to Jay's earlier slides, this is obviously where the threats and the vulnerabilities are going to come from. So if I just put up a typical architecture, one that we've seen before with our instruments, PLCs, and SCADA, moving up into our MES level, through a DMZ, and finally up to an enterprise layer. So this is essentially taken out of guidelines from 62443, where we start talking about zones and conduits. But when considering your network security, it is best to start with the guidelines that we can see within the ISA 99, IEC, ISO standards. Following on from that, it's really critical that we manage that perimeter, lock out what is actually potentially could come into our network. Now that could be done by various ways, whether that's use firewalling, whitelisting, denying traffic by default, as opposed to, allowing all and then trying to lock out. And then, of course, protecting the internal, which again gives you the ability to create these zones, create these network layers. If we then look at monitoring, what kind of monitoring systems can we get on our network? Obviously, there's the two, intrusion detection and intrusion prevention systems. Control systems are very unique to the IT layer. The amount of traffic is by far more, but it's actually more deterministic. You actually understand what kind of traffic is going to be running on your SCADA and PLC level. Also, intrusion detection looks at monitoring at the out of the norm limits. So it basically monitors and then flags up any sort of traffic that it doesn't understand or doesn't actually fit. So it's quite a passive, as opposed to the intrusion prevention. And this is what's caused some of the OT engineers to actually not implement any systems, because they're always thinking it's a prevention system, whereas obviously intrusion detection is just about monitoring. What we also see is a cyber attack of any nature doesn't always have to be to disrupt and to remove the availability of our control system. It can actually just sit there quite quietly, gathering the intellectual property, gathering your data, whether it's to use it to make a counterfeit product or maybe outbid you when submitting a huge proposal. We also realize that to implement a truly fully functional monitoring system can be very costly. Take a lot of time before you actually see any sort of rewards. And in the ideal world, and what we're certainly moving to in the next 2 to 3 years, is actually having an artificial intelligence, machine learning, to actually give us that behavioral analysis of network data. So I'd just like to hand you back to Andy to go through some more monitoring.
Yeah, so what we're introducing here is our managed platform XALIA solution. Now, there's lots of monitoring solutions out there on the market, and part of the problem with this is that it creates a lot of noise. So if you've had your IT teams introduce one of those enterprise systems into your network, you're probably getting a lot of alerts, a lot of emails, they certainly are, and it's how that data is interpreted. The idea of this is that these alerts, these messages that come from this type of system in your industrial control network go to our team of experts back in our office. So you don't have to interpret all that data. We already know that there's skills gaps. You know, we're under-resourced already, so everybody's busy. The idea is that we can actually get much more out of our control system than and very related to our industrial control network rather than it just being an IT layer. One of the ways that our customers use this is from like a baseline perspective. It works particularly well when you're thinking of doing things like upgrades. So if you've taken a baseline, you've got the system in place, you know what types of messages you're getting on a regular basis. We provide things like reports to you on a regular basis as well. If you do that migration, how does your system then behave? What are the differences? What are the changes? It's very hard to quantify that when you can't see some of that underlying technology and the underlying messages that come from a system like this. So it's really important for our customers to be able to do that. We do it in a number of ways, and there's a very simple architecture here. So we install something called an XALIA gateway on your manufacturing layer. It does go out to a cloud-based scenario. So certainly when we get onto the next sessions and we're talking about things like the Demilitarized Zone, it's really important we secure it through the same methods. This is where I was referring to taking it to our team in the office, our managed services team, so that they can monitor, respond to you for something critical. And we've tailored those messages so that we know what types of things are critical coming from your network. And also from a systems integrator perspective, we can help enable you from a services role because it's really important to make sure your end users are covered and your end users are getting the best possible service. So we've just gone through that network security section, and now what I'm going to start talking about is this demilitarized zone that exists in the middle here. So this is a layer that Jay mentioned earlier, and I've done this through a few examples. So we've naturally related this to Wonderware because you're hopefully used to seeing our Wonderware products out there. And it was an easy way to do that. So one of the products that has come out on the market in the last few years is something called In-Touch Access Anywhere. So what this does is it allows you to get access to your SCADA system directly on a mobile device. It's full control if you'd like. You can do it in read-only. Obviously, if there's full control, then there's things out there that you might not want people to be accessing, and there has to be the right security protocols in place from a PLC layer to accommodate that. If you're doing this in a local area network, it's arguably much easier. You can do things like whitelisting. You can have client access lists so that only the MAC addresses from specific devices have access to that network. So if somebody logs in to the wireless network and because they have the password, because they're not on that control access list, they won't get access. Lots of companies adopt it in that way. But it's when we want to get it out to that enterprise layer or even out to a wide area network. And built into the In-Touch Access Anywhere scenario, and this is a software perspective, they have something called an In-Touch Access Anywhere secure gateway. So we install it at the demilitarized zone layer, and it's very, very similar to what you'll see with things like your VPNs on your network. So when you're logging in and you want to be part of that network when you're external, it's a very similar process. So it opens up the right ports in the right directions, but it'll only ever allow you access to that server at that bottom manufacturing layer. And that's what's key there. It's about making sure that you don't have access direct from that enterprise zone to the manufacturing layer. We're always going through this middle layer in there, that demilitarized zone. And this is naturally starting to extend to data. Data is one of the biggest things that we've talked about for years and years, that big data environment. It's been a bit of a data explosion, and it will not stop. We are getting more and more devices on our network, so we're starting to need to share that with more people. I've got a customer example here, and this is a customer that was certainly, they use this data that they stored in their Wonderware historian for their entire business. So their entire bespoke website was shaped around it. They needed access to it 24/7, but they were also leaders in security. So years ago, they noticed that actually we're accessing the data, albeit through the standard historian client tools, directly at our manufacturing zones, and we shouldn't be doing that. So they asked us to help them out. So what we did was introduced a tier 2 Wonderware historian at that demilitarized zone layer. And the idea then is that we're now pushing data from those manufacturing zones up to that centralized layer, and then our enterprise zones are just accessing that demilitarized zone layer, or even further out if we wanted it to. But again, it's key that we use that centralized environment. And this is certainly extending out even further, so we could have multiple plants, we could have multiple devices, and now with the advent of things like cloud historians through our Wonderware Online scenario, we can get data from even more places. And it's important that what we do is extend that data and we push it out through that same layer and that same security method through that demilitarized zone. We do it through proxy servers. We make sure we utilize IT-friendly ports such as 443. We make sure we introduce whitelisting and endpoints and things like that. It's really key that we're securing that outbound connection, and it's a push from that manufacturing layer out to that cloud environment. And then you have things like built into the software where the data is protected at rest and in motion through encryption. The Wonderware historian is still that same product that was sitting on the cloud. You just don't see the bulk and the standard configuration at the bottom end, but it still adheres to things like CFR 21 Part 11 compliance. So it's a very simple way to get that data out to more and more people. And again, this is extending even further. So yes, the last example I showed you, getting data onto that online environment. But now we can do that, and now we're starting to see these weird and wonderful devices coming online at the bottom layer, and perhaps are not part of your control system. So how do we get that data up there? We should still use the same security methodology to do that. We should still use that DMZ layer to get that outbound data push, make sure we have the local store and forward of the data to ensure that if we lose any connections, then we can still access it at a later point in time. We're talking about really low-powered, low bandwidth connections and assets at the bottom layer there. People like Sigfox who deal with very lightweight protocols. It's still really key that we secure that layer. What I have now is just a short case study, and this is from a water company in the United States. And this shows them using some of these Wonderware Online technologies to show how it benefits them and their systems, their users.
I got into technology because I'm a very curious person. I got into electronics when I was in the Army. Learned how to fix a lot of different electronic devices. And when I was finishing up college, I found a job at this OEM manufacturer in Winter Haven, Florida. And I started as an instrument tech with them. Over a year or two, I started looking over the guy's shoulders and saw that they could actually turn stuff on with wire and a piece of software, and I got hooked. My name is Russell Carver, Technology Coordinator for Seminole County. The nice part about this job is I have instant gratification. I get to see the result before it goes out the door, and then I know I'm providing clean drinking water for the residents of Seminole County. It's really easy to get complacent, but my curiosity is what drives me forward to learn new technologies. Makes my job easier and hopefully makes the jobs easier for the rest of the county. I've been using Wonderware products since roughly 1993. It's kind of nice to see how they always keep up with technology. My salesman introduced me to Smart Glance, and it just seemed like a perfect fit because I trust their technology, I trust their security, and the product just works. And with 5 water plants and 2 wastewater plants, I had all their data there that afternoon. It was just easy to set up. With all the problems going around lately with water systems and the issues they've been having, it's nice to know that we have a system in place that takes care of that, and we can monitor things from our phones, from our tablets, and from the local SCADA machines. It helps us be more confident that we'll avoid future problems or issues.
It's a good use case, and some of the technologies you've seen up there were a little bit out of date because the case studies are, it's a couple of years old. Online technology moves on very, very quickly these days. At lunchtime, I'm going to be showing where that technology has moved on to from Wonder Online perspective. So if you want to come and see me, I'm more than happy to talk to you in more detail about it. But for the next section, Tim's just going to go into patch management for you.
Thanks, Andy. So let's just take a look in the past. This ties into the fact that previous architectures were also kept isolated from one another. So essentially, patching a control system was seen to be, it was fine if we didn't do it because it wasn't even connected to anything. Going into today, and obviously the awareness that we're all having with cybersecurity and the vulnerabilities that maybe exist in the operating systems, people are taking a move to try and patch their control systems, but still inconsistent at best, and maybe not even existent at the very worst. Moving to the future, we're obviously encouraging that the OT and the IT collaborate more. We're seeing a lot of standards and principles being driven down from the IT layer, but it's still up to the OT experts that know the control systems to educate the IT personnel in how these systems operate, what needs to be done before a patch gets carried out, how do we test, etc. So if I bring in Andy now, this is a customer issue that Andy's going to run through, and I'll cover what the solution was.
Yeah, so this is a customer that's certainly very IT focused. So they were led by that enterprise layer. And what that meant was they would automatically update their servers on a very regular basis, midnight each week. So these are all the Microsoft security patches that we see coming through. The way that they do that is as soon as one of the servers, and they had lots of servers in their infrastructure, as soon as one of them responded to a ping, they'd then start the update on the next one, give it a restart. And what this resulted in was data loss every single time. And our SIs or their SI was called out on a number of occasions to resolve an emergency scenario. So then they got us involved from a solution perspective and asked for our assistance in how they rectify that.
And that was where we said, look, let's get all the stakeholders, let's all have a meeting, basically getting everyone's thoughts so that we can discuss the impact, devise a policy, draw up procedures, and that would obviously be on backups and the restoring of those backups, how to deploy. We also highlighted, or as a team, it was highlighted that the critical steps was for everyone to understand the support for the patch management. Obviously for OT to realize just how important it is to patch your systems. And also that the IT understands that there's certain failover capabilities of system platform. The servers need to be restored and running for a certain amount of time so that synchronization can take place before you take down the other server. And again, it just highlights the need for the OT and IT collaboration. So we've covered the DMZ. We're moving on to the manufacturing zone.
Yeah, so this is this layer in the middle here, and what I'm going to talk to you about with regards to this is a bit about incident management and disaster recovery. Now, I'm purposely not going to go into any detail here because we have Chris Whitehead at the back who's going to do an excellent session next, going into the disaster recovery solution that we have in our portfolio. But the idea of this is that everybody does it, or they should do, or when they are doing it, it tends to be to things like tape drives. Are those tape drives tested? It's one of the biggest scare elements to our disaster recovery scenarios. We don't want to test it in case something goes wrong with our system. We bring the plant down. Chris will explain exactly how we combat that and how we provide that service to give you something where you're not scared to test it. There's a brief example of how we do that here. Again, it's just a very simple architecture, and Chris will go into some of the detail of it, but it essentially works through a local replication server where we're storing our backups. And again, it's managed by our managed services team, so they're the guys that are getting those alerts and things back at a central location, so you don't have to worry about the integrity of it. Chris will go into the detail of how the encryption works and things like that, and there's something really good there with our ransomware detection that's built into that product too. But in terms of managing user privileges, so this is, I suppose, the next section. If we look at the past, really what we were looking at was individual user management. We tend to sit in work groups. We'd have lots of users configured. Quite often, they were shared accounts. So you'll have a lot of systems out there that have admin or engineer, so you log into the system. In the same way, it's very hard to tell who's logged in and what's happened as you're going through. What we're seeing now in our architectures is that, or we certainly promote this from a systems architect perspective, is that we integrate that managing the user privileges through an Active Directory, through that domain controller. Typically, it'll be a local domain controller to that control system, and you won't link it into your enterprise layer, but there's different ways that we can do it. You can trust the domains and things through that DMZ layer. We still see a lot of scenarios where we introduce Active Directory, but actually we still have those shared users across the board, so we can still log in the same way. People don't forget the passwords. But then at best, what we're referring to here is a bit more than that, a bit more than just having individual user accounts, ways to make sure you know exactly who's logging onto the system, so you can have those audit trails, so you can see who's done what. And what we're really referring to here when we get to the future scenarios is a location-based authentication. So yes, there's lots of things we can do with things like geometric scanners. We can do it with RFID tags. But the next video that I'm going to show you is around our Theme Manager solution. We have a session on it this afternoon if you're sticking around to have a play with the scenario, not this one particularly, but certainly the software itself. But this allows us to then get a bit more multi-level authentication out of the system through a location-based awareness.
We all know the ease that comes with day-to-day use of Theme Manager. Now let's focus on the security and data safety. Theme Manager gives you complete control in your production environment over who sees what, where, and when. Let's take a look. Here we have a side-by-side view of our production floor with our line supervisor Jim and our control room with Phil, our controls engineer. Phil is using Theme Manager to set up the packaging line terminal where Jim primarily works. Phil sets this terminal by default to show the HMI for the packaging line. This allows anyone at the line to see the HMI and current status of the packaging line. It also locks the client from showing any other data or assets without further user authentication. Next, Phil sets up Jim as a user to be able to receive the daily reports he needs as a supervisor, along with 3 applications he uses frequently on the floor as a line supervisor. Phil sets them to automatically tile on the screen when Jim logs in. With the integration of Active Directory, Theme Manager displays can be set up by user, group, or role to show exactly what the user needs, when, and where they need it. He can choose one to interact with or cycle through them with a drop-down menu or hotkeys. Authentication is completed securely using methods like traditional usernames and passwords, or by using ID badge readers or even biometric fingerprint scanners. Once Jim finishes his objective, he simply logs out and the terminal returns to the default HMI in which it started. His data is now Phil, our controls engineer, has decided it would be very handy to incorporate the flexibility and mobility of an iPad for use around Jim's production line. Specifically, he wants Jim to be able to get closer to the line while viewing the HMI from the mainline terminal. For security of operations, though, Phil doesn't want that iPad and HMI to be able to leave and be operational from anywhere else but the specific production line. Location-based resolvers with Thin Manager can be set up using Bluetooth, QR codes, NFC, Wi-Fi, or GPS, or any combination desired to create geofences for total security when integrating mobility into your production environment. Using a small Bluetooth beacon at the production line, Phil creates a fence around the line in which the iPad is allowed to function. He can then set the iPad up in Thin Manager as a terminal with the location of the Bluetooth area he has created. Once authenticated with Thin Manager's ITMC app on the iPad, Jim can now scan the QR code on the terminal and transfer the HMI from the terminal to the iPad and walk over to the line for a closer look when needed. If Jim leaves the designated Bluetooth area or logs out, the HMI simply transfers from the iPad and returns to the main terminal. Now that's secure, safe, and productive. You can easily see the power of the location resolvers in Thin Manager. The idea is to create a scalable and flexible production environment while still having the complete control over who sees what, when, and where. Thin Manager is the easiest and most secure way to add and use mobility in today's modern factory. Thin Manager, the global leader in thin client management and industrial mobility solutions.
You may know Thin Manager best as our management for our RDS scenarios, and it certainly is that and continues to be that. But we now have the option to go much further from a future perspective and really put in those location-based resolvers. I'm now going to hand back to Tim, who's going to go into the virtualization aspect of it's really the natural next step from a centralized management perspective.
Thanks, Andy. So again, when we look at what was being done previously, we all had sort of individual physical machines. They were communicating directly to the PLC, had the SCADA on them. That was great. On big plants, you just had more of them. But that obviously came with the effort to have to maintain all of them. Certainly, as a systems architect, we're seeing pretty much 80% of our proposals have virtualization included in them. This is essentially a drive to, yes, conserve and capitalize on having less space in our data centers, but also it reduces our attack surface area. We're also not saying that by virtualizing, you're actually making your system more secure, but you are able to start leveraging other technologies that lend themselves to making yourself more secure. It's important to mention as well that when virtualizing, you also have to secure that hypervisor. There are steps that you need to do to make sure you're still keeping safe. And we can also look towards the future where we're not just talking about having systems on premise, but actually using, sort of cloud-based virtualization. So cloud isn't for everyone. We understand that control systems will always be probably kept within your factory. Whatever systems you're running, I certainly know as a controls engineer in my past life, that was something that made me feel safer and not perhaps putting it into the cloud. But there are requirements that do lend themselves to the online solutions. And then there's a third option where you can actually have the best of both. And this could come from, let's say, a control system, but obviously sending data up to the cloud that you can share and have KPIs easily available. Thanks, Andy. I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, so in terms of the malware protection and things about endpoint antivirus, Jay's already alluded to this again in his earlier presentation. If we look at the past, there's certainly little to no protection. We're relying, again, in a very similar way on that isolation. We're isolated, so we're inherently secure. Just isn't the case. And we're certainly very lucky if Windows is up to date in any way, shape, or form. Our present is that we're adopting an IT standard of antivirus. So we're putting something on there. We're monitoring against reactive scenarios where things might happen, and then we're looking to see. These are actually quite resource intensive, so you probably see on a daily basis. Certainly on our work laptops, I see it in mine at a certain time each day. My CPU usage will spike because the scanning of those drives has happened, and it is becoming more resource intensive. Certainly from a SCADA perspective, in a lot of scenarios, and it isn't just Wonderware, there's lots of them out there, we have to exclude specific files and directories from being scanned. For very good reason that these protection systems aren't clever enough to understand that by locking out those files, you're going to corrupt elements of your SCADA scenario. So it's really important. And then when we get on to Steve Jr. that we mentioned earlier, these signature updates, they happen on a very regular basis. So if you want to stay secure, you want to protect against all the latest threats, you're having to update that system on a very regular basis. So from a future perspective, what we're really referring to here is an IDS, an intrusion detection system, that is much more about behavioral changes, artificial intelligence, and like learning algorithms in the background. It's certainly much more lightweight. Reason being is that it understands our industrial network. That's the whole point of these systems. And the idea is that because it's behavioral and we're looking at algorithms, the algorithms don't need updating quite as often. So we're talking about much less updates with regards to it. So we've now gone through the manufacturing zone, and then lastly, the place that you're probably all very familiar with is that SCADA zone. I'm going to hand back to Tim to start us off.
Thanks, Andy. So if we just have a look at the SCADA zone, and obviously you've seen the video now on Thin Manager. So if we just zoom in now and looking at the use of thin clients, these are devices that have no hard drive. So there's no software that's going to be loaded or contained on these units. So if they're taken, stolen, you're not losing any data. Obviously, it's also very easy to get back up and run again if one does suffer a failure. You can lock down your USB ports on these devices. So again, we've seen how when Jay said they left USB sticks on the windscreens of the cars, anyone plugging a USB stick into a thin client that's been securely locked down, it's not going to read that USB stick. Also, the backup process is greatly simplified because everything is residing on a central server. So it's in one place, no matter how many clients you have on your shop floor. And you still want to obviously put in that authentication Active Directory so that you can secure your access from user to terminal. So if we look at this basic example, we have essentially eight thick clients. So these are PCs that are running an operating system that have the SCADA software installed on them. And it's easy to see that each one of these is going to have to be maintained or should be maintained. That's from a patching perspective, updates from the SCADA system. And again, it's how are we going to improve our efficiency if we have to maintain all 8 of those. Looking at using a thin client architecture, you can have that single RDS server. Yes, in actually a production environment, you would have a redundant RDS server, but that's still only 2 servers that you would be maintaining. And then you'd still have your 8 thin clients. You could take this a little bit further and use sort of firewalls that do deep packet inspection. And what we mean by that is actually firewalls that actually understand the OT protocols, such as DNP, the Ethernet-based Modbus. This allows for us to, again, secure our sort of zoning between SCADA and PLC layer, in that the firewalls are only going to let through the information that it understands. So we've come to the end of the SCADA zone. Just a bit of a wrap-up. We started off with this cybersecurity maturity model. And the message from us is that it's important to know where you are in this cycle. It's important to obviously take small steps. So just like that graph that Tony showed, it's not about spending as much as you can. It's about understanding what you have and what you need to do first. And more importantly, to try and start now. And then realizing that it's the technology and the processes that you want to empower and educate your people to basically bring it all together. So one final slide for myself. We realize we can't live in the past and keep our systems isolated. People are already moving and implementing MIS or MES systems and seeing the benefits, but it obviously exposes risk that we are now looking to mitigate and clamp down and make it secure. And moving into the future, we're looking for a digital supply chain that's going to obviously make us more efficient and optimize our plants. Thanks very much.
Thank you, guys.